Good morning, everyone. I'm Donna McInerney. I'm the CEO of the Foundation for Educational Administration, and I want to welcome you today. We are delighted to partner with Arts Ed New Jersey to offer today's program, Transforming Schools Through the Power of the Arts. Not only are the arts a pathway to a well-rounded education, they are a critical component. We know both anecdotally and from the research base that when schools and districts make a meaningful and consistent commitment to the arts, a number of outcomes occur. Climate and culture improve, engagement between schools and families and the community are strengthened, academic learning outcomes are strengthened, and social emotional development outcomes are strengthened. Here at FEA, we've had a long-standing commitment to providing joint professional learning around the arts and arts integration. We've supported schools in this effort, ensuring that there's a clear and consistent message that student learning and the arts go hand in hand, and we could not have done this without our partners. Arts Ed New Jersey has been one of our partners for several years. We've also partnered with the Dodge Foundation, and I believe their representative will be arriving soon, to offer a summer institute for the last several years at Princeton, New Jersey. Last summer we had a record number of teams, 32 teams arriving. So take a look at our website for more information on that Arts Integration Institute, formerly called the Ed Leaders as Scholars. I want to make sure that you understand that today is promising and will be filled with learning about the arts. We have a wide variety of voices in our panelists. It will be an engaging day and built on a lot of collaboration. Before we go any further, I want to introduce Bob Morrison from Arts Ed New Jersey, who will take over and MC the event of today. Is that right?
Yep. Thank you, Donna.
Thanks, Bob.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Okay, we have to do much better than that, or it's going to be a really, really long day. So good morning, everyone. Good morning. Much better, much better. My name is Bob Morrison. I'm the director of Arts Ed New Jersey, and it's a pleasure to have you all here today for what we believe is going to be informative but also critically important information regarding what's happening with the state plan for the Every Student Succeeds Act and what it means for connecting back in your communities, in your school districts, and how the arts intersect with that. Before we get started, there are a couple housekeeping duties that I need to take care of. In case it's not obvious yet, we're filming today. So in case you needed some clues about that, we are filming today. And the purpose for this is such an important topic, and we've assembled such a great panel of presenters that we wanted to make sure that we had a way to capture this and share it for others in the field that may not be able to be here. So we're actually going to be putting this together as a professional development presentation that we'll make available on the website at Arts Ed New Jersey so that your colleagues who didn't have the benefit of being here would be able to be here. That said, if you are camera shy, then you may want to move to a strategic location that would keep you out of that. Otherwise, I think that you're in for a really, really good day. I'm going to be your cruise director for the day, so I will be making sure that we're moving from segment to segment, as well as participating with in some of the segments. But our captain is actually Kira Rizzuto, who actually put all of this together. Kira will be able to answer any questions that you have regarding any of the other logistics, but it's because of her work that we're able to put this particular presentation on today. We've got a fantastic lineup of people. Our first session this morning, we're going to hear from the Department of Education, as well as Rosie Grant from Patterson, who will be talking about what's happening and how they're connecting to this work in Patterson, New Jersey. Then I'll be talking about how the arts really intersect with every aspect of vsESSA that we'll be talking about today. Then we've got a panel of people that have actually been involved in the creating of the state plan. So we have Rosa Sarah from the state PTA with us. Rosie Grant will be with us on that panel as well. Vince DeLucia is joining us from the New Jersey School Boards Association, was also involved in the crafting of that plan, and Diana Pasquuli from the Department of Ed will participate in that panel, which will be asking them a couple of questions, but really then opening it up to you to ask questions of the panelists as well. If you do have a question, we'd ideally like you to come up to the microphone just so that we can capture the question for the audio and for the video that we're putting together. Then this afternoon, we've got practitioners. What's happening in the real world? How is what we've talked about in the morning transfer to what's actually happening in some schools? So we'll be hearing from Adrian Hill, who is one of our rock star principals of Hedgepath Williams Middle School for the Arts in Trenton, New Jersey, who's done a phenomenal job taking some of the things that we'll talk about today and actually actualizing that within her particular district. And then we've got Dave Wish, the CEO of Little Kids Rock. We'll talk about how their program has been used to address some of the areas of ESSA within communities, not only here in New Jersey, but in hundreds of communities across the country and in thousands of schools across the country now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first session, and this morning our first session is going to be led by who I view as the architect of our state ESSA plan. When the requirements came out that every state had to develop their own plan for ESSA, Diana Pasquuli was at the Department of Education, and it was her job to wrangle all of the cats, all of the stakeholders in the state, to provide their input into what would be the development of the state plan. Diana is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Performance at the Department of Education, and she will be joined during her presentation by Dr. Dale Schmid, who is the coordinator for the visual and performing arts, as well as gifted and talented at the Department of Education, as well as Rosie Grant, who is the executive director of Patterson Education Fund. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diana Pasquuli.
Thank you, Bob. It's an honor to be here. I was really excited about the day, and even just planning for this day allowed me personally to get to work with a lot of amazing educators and folks, advocates in the field for arts. So I'm personally excited as someone who comes from a family that spent a lot of time. My sister's a music teacher in northern New Jersey, and my brother's a performing artist in Chicago and a professor of performing arts. So this is very near and dear to my heart, just as coming from Diana. And then from the department, we're really excited to be part of this day to have a conversation with advocates, with educators about the ways that the ESSA state plan that was developed, as Bob mentioned, in consultation and in collaboration with stakeholders from all over the state, how that's playing out. Our plan was adopted over a year ago, and so we've done a lot of work since and have a lot of more work to go. But this is hopefully, and Bob's going to help us do this, is make some connections between the architecture of that plan, the role of the department, which we view as one main role is to be really focused on support for all of our students, and so thinking about how we can work together to make sure that that happens. And so that's why we begin all of our conversations, whether it's on the ESSA plan or whether we're talking about assessments or career and technology opportunities for students. Whatever we're talking about, we like to begin with our students, because that's what it's all about. And you'll hear a very technical presentation from me about the law and the calculations and formulas that we use to figure out how to help our schools. But at the end of the day, it's all meant to figure out how we can better support schools and districts as you and your communities support your students. So we like to keep the eye on that goal. This visual is something that the division, so I'm the Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Performance, as mentioned, and that's 1/3 of a division in the Department of Education that's called the Academics and Performance Division. And so I've been working really closely with new and former colleagues at the department over the last year, and we've been trying to articulate the connection from the academic perspective of how we are looking at, as a state, the standards that we by law are obligated to adopt. We work with our state board and put standards in place for many academic areas. And then how we look at that for some subjects, we're responsible for statewide assessment systems, which also falls under my corner of the world right now. And we are working in collaboration to design better systems particularly within assessments, to improve that tool. And because assessments and performance reports, which I'm going to talk a lot about and as part of our ESSA plan, are just some types of actionable data that we can provide at the state. This is something that we have access to, statewide data and we want to be able to be giving it to you in your communities to help your students with it. So it's really just a tool. You'll hear a lot about how there's a huge element of our data work that comes from us to you in strictly a support capacity. And then just as a general cycle, we believe that is our goal, to be supporting professional learning all around the state. This Commissioner Repollet is particularly dedicated to this view as being a lifelong educator of, why are we here on earth at the department? We do have to do a lot of compliance work, and that is a big chunk of our work. We have to implement a lot of different programs, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're supporting and we're focused on that teaching and learning aspect. And so I feel grateful to be in an agency that really has been focusing on that. So the ESSA context and then the plan is just a little bit of a history lesson. And, I, as mentioned, worked on this in a former position. There are a lot of different folks now at the department working on aspects of this plan. I came because Bob asked me to, and because I respect him greatly, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So the little bit of this is historical context and just placing of what do we do at the department? What is the NJDOE, and where are we coming from when you read about things in the paper? So, for instance, in the coming weeks, the Department of Education is putting out school performance reports. Those are reports that we've put out for many years with a lot of different data points all on about individual schools. And since last year, we've put out school and district reports. That information, again, is a dashboard. It is a collection of a lot of data that's reported by districts. So sometimes this is very much, sometimes we are just reporting on what's reported to us, and that comes to us in varying degrees of quality, frankly, and we can talk about that later. But that is meant to be informational for communities, and I'm excited to talk to you today about how we envision that as one. We use the word accountability because it's a tool that puts the accountability in the hands of the communities to have conversations about data that's occurring. To be clear, and I just want to reemphasize this throughout these slides, I'm talking about the state role. So when we talk about a performance report, we talk about data that you're using in your communities. That's not, we know that's not exhaustive. And we know that there's anecdotal evidence, there's more data that is collected from a classroom level, at a student level, and in school communities. But I'm coming from the perspective of the State Department, and so that's where I'm going to stay in that lane today. So we look at so school reporting is one of what I think to be one of our superpowers at the state, because we are the one agency that has a bird's eye view of the state. And we care a lot about providing you that information. We also have responsibilities under state law to be monitoring our districts. We support them, but we also have under a QSAC law on our, which comes from our state statute in the legislature, we're obligated to make sure that all of our districts are complying with the many, many laws that we have in our state. And that's in an effort to, those are mechanisms put in place to make sure our students are receiving a thorough and efficient education, and that's a big aspect of our field services and how we support. So we're constantly balancing that compliance with support of, if schools and districts are not meeting the requirements, which are often minimum requirements, we should put that out there, it is our job to be supporting those districts. And finally, and what we're going to talk about and where this fits in is our school ESSA our school ESSA accountability system is very dictated by the federal law, so which is interesting difference. But our federal law focuses a great deal more on schools, and we have to, by law, be looking at all of our schools, about 2,500, all public schools. That includes charters, and we're looking to identify where schools need more help. And so what we're going to talk about today is the federal law how that federal law works in requiring us to look at the schools in New Jersey and to identify, and a lot of how we identify what schools need help is prescribed under that federal law. So in part of the ESSA plan, one of our goals was to bring things together a little bit more coherently. And so what you'll probably can get confusing at a district level and at a school level is that in the past, given all of our laws in the United States and in our state, we sometimes find that schools and districts in the past have had to have different plans, have been on different cycles of evaluating data. And so one of our goals in the ESSA plan and now in our support under the Commissioner Rep Billette is to be helping districts make some of the planning and the process a little bit more coherent. And that's something, so we're trying to make sure that the accountability systems from the state are a little bit more aligned, and and that goes all the way down to the district. We're in the process, though, right? So I mentioned this is only the second year, and we're always continually improving. So one of the things that came out of our plan, and something that we already have schools engaged in, is a more cohesive school plan. And what I want to pause on this for is because we're going to talk a lot about today how advocates and educators can be more engaged at a district level with the process of identifying what the students in your community need. And one of the outcomes of our ESSA plan was that if a school is identified for support, this plan is mandated, and there have been mandated plans since even before No Child Left Behind. But right now, that's where we start. When schools are struggling, and we'll talk about how we identify that, but when schools are struggling or districts are struggling to meet the needs of our students, we have seen over the course of history that a lot of times there's a paralysis or there are capacity issues within the whole cycle of education and learning, of identifying what our schools need, of collecting the right data at the right place, understanding what to look at in your communities, and then to say, okay, why? Why are our students, we're going to talk a lot about why some students aren't coming to school. Let's look at that. What is the issue? And why are students struggling in a math class? Why are students struggling in any of our courses? Why is there excessive amounts of unsafe behaviors going on in our school, right? Like whatever data you're looking at, and that's the whole child data as a community, you're going to think about where are areas where your students are flourishing and doing well, and what are areas where students can need more support from you in your school community and district community. So that's a process that we do as educators every day. Any teacher in a classroom, this is a cycle that happens every single time. As you expand from the classroom, from teacher to student and expand to the classroom, it gets a little more complicated because, as it turns out, not every single student needs the same thing every single day. And then it gets more complicated as you roll up to a school and a district. So we're going to talk today about, and this is what I'm really excited about as I'm personally passionate, is how you engage in those communities and how we build capacity to be having conversations as communities about looking at what our students need and looking at that root cause analysis together. When we talk about engagement, we talk about that starting at this root cause analysis of how we can bring parents, how we can bring administrators and teachers and students to the table and say, what's going on here and how can we help our students? Then it's about creating a plan. And so the annual school plan, there are official aspects of that, but it's also just good, it's just good work, right? I mean, if you go to a company, you have strategic plans, a well-tuned company. If you're going to a classroom, teachers have a very good vision of a strategic plan, and that's true for schools and districts. And where we see students flourishing, we see communities aligned to the priorities in their schools, and we see growth. And that's what we care the most about. And then there's the implementation and progress monitoring, and that happens again at a school level, a district level, and a state. So this is a little theoretical. Like I said, it does kind of narrow down to some paperwork, because everything at the department narrows down to some paperwork at some level. But that's something I want us to keep in mind as we're talking about how this all plays out when we talk about reports and engagement. So the state plan. This is the this is the slide. I think Rosie made us create this. So we and I think this is something that's really important as we talk about engagement, right? And I think some of us, I'll speak from the perspective of the state, is we sometimes forget the 101 aspect. So if you're engaging, and this is where I appreciate Bob, is like today's about arts, but this is the 101 of the ESSA state plan, so that as we're engaging, we can have a mutual understanding of with the parameters within where we're working, and kind of where certain requirements come from. So this can get confusing at the state level, and this is something that's not always clear at a classroom level, which is that we in New Jersey do have to comply with federal law, and there's a federal law. There's a 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was put in place during the Civil Rights era, and that never went away. Sometimes it has had a lot of different forms. The most famous form was No Child Left Behind, which was a reenactment of that Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Then, and the purpose of that act historically has been to find ways to provide more funding and support to schools and students that have the greatest need in our country. That has evolved, like I said, over many years in different forms, and the Every Student Succeeds Act that was signed by President Obama was the last reenactment of that law. So it's all the same law, just in different shapes and sizes, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's evolved, but the basic premise is we, at the federal government, are going to give you states money, and then we're going to make sure that you're spending it on the students that need it the most. And that's the intent. We know that sometimes that has been implemented with varying degrees of success, but that's what that is. And when we talk about the difference between a state and a federal aspect, one key difference is that federal funding is monitored very tightly. It's our job at the state to monitor how we're distributing federal funds directly to districts. So that's sort of where we come into play, and a lot of it does revolve around those resources that come from the federal government and how we as a state have responsibility to make sure that it's being used wisely. And Dale's going to talk to you a lot about not just how we use it wisely, but how we use it to benefit thoughtfully, and how we use it creatively and innovatively to benefit our students. So that's one of the most exciting parts of today. So because No Child Left Behind was so famous or infamous, it's important to kind of ground ourselves in the Every Student Succeeds Act differences, because a lot of people understood No Child Left Behind. A lot of people, since I started teaching the first year it was being implemented, and everyone, I think, in the lexicon understood annual year progress, or it felt like a lot of people understood that No Child Left Behind set forth goals for the entire country, and every student got the same goal, and that was to be 100% proficiency by a certain year. And so there are aspects of No Child Left Behind that were very rigid, and the ESSA, however, was a big transition from some of the rigid aspects of No Child Left Behind. So under both, we have to have state standards. It's our job as a state to make sure that we have academic standards. That wasn't a change even under No Child Left Behind for New Jersey. We've had state standards for multiple decades, and we're in advance of a lot of other states. We also have to have our assessments, just like No Child Left Behind, for certain grades, for certain subjects, math, ELA, and for science. We have to have statewide assessments, which are meant to monitor the progress of our students towards those standards in those specific subjects. We also have to set long-term goals. Here's where ESSA started being a little bit more flexible. So we as states set our own long-term goals to monitor the progress of our schools. And for accountability, No Child Left Behind focused primarily on proficiency and graduation rates. ESSA focused on a few different measures. We had to, as a state, identify an academic proficiency measure. We also had to identify an academic growth measure. And that is something that we took and ran with it here in New Jersey. So we, across multiple administrations, have been very excited about that transition, and because we feel that it is a very key measure to look at about how our students are progressing versus whether or not they've met a certain benchmark. Both are important, but as a state, we've acknowledged that growth is more important when you're looking at what schools need help. So we find that schools that are stagnant typically need more help than schools that are growing. And so even if some schools in certain areas with students of all different backgrounds, maybe they aren't, a lot of them maybe aren't meeting proficiency yet. When you look at growth, student growth and progress, you see a lot of infrastructure, you see a lot of community involvement, you see a lot of good things happening that allows us to recalibrate our supports to the schools and say, okay, you know, maybe as a district, or as a state, we're going to focus on a school district that is not growing and progressing, because we need to be supporting them through that planning process. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just want to keep tying it back to our role and why we care about certain measures. It's not just for real estate agents to know where to send people and housing and rankings. We care a lot about the information and how we're able to utilize the flexibilities in ESSA. So, excuse me. So we look at growth. We still look at graduation rates. We also, under law, have to look at English language learners' progress towards proficiency, and that's something that is in our current plan and went into place this year. And then we had to identify at least one other indicator of school quality or student success. And after a lot of conversations in New Jersey from very diverse perspectives all over the state, we landed on using chronic absenteeism as a small percentage as an important measure. And Rosie's going to talk a lot about it. She talks about it better than I do, but we'll talk about it, and I'll touch on it later as well. So another big change in No Child Left Behind, there were steps. There were prescriptive steps of, you know, if you aren't meeting certain goals, then these 6 things will happen to your school. And infamously, we know that some of them the state was mandated to close certain schools or to convert them. That changed a lot under ESSA, that there's a lot more collaboration with the state and district. And so that was a big change. And school district plans, that still has to happen, but we're trying to do some legwork to connect it better from schools that are identified for support to districts. I like this because I think, like I said, people to varying degrees knew No Child Left Behind a little bit better than they knew ESSA. But are there any questions about that I can either field or get back to you if it's beyond my expertise?
Just a really simple one. Would we be able to get these?
This slide?
This slide.
Yes, you
Should I
can.
ask that there?
Thanks to Kira.
Sorry, here we go.
My question already answered is whether we can get these slides. The answer is yes, so we're all grateful. Thank you.
Sure. And I'm grateful for the chance to take some water. So moving on, this all together is, the next part is the formula for how we identify what schools need the most support. The state plan went into place, it's just all such a blur, a year and a half ago now, August of 2017. And so last January, we identified our first cohort of schools that require the most comprehensive and targeted support. This year, recently, we are in the process of identifying the second cohort. And we use this formula, we use this calculation to figure out where we should go and focus our federal dollars and our support at the department level. So just really quickly, the takeaway from this slide is I already mentioned the different measures that are used to calculate what's called a summative rating. You'll see the SGP for elementary and middle schools and graduation for high schools is what's weighted the the most heavily. And that came from, we actually proposed, at the department, we proposed first to stakeholders to weight equally proficiency and growth. Again, that's a big move from No Child Left Behind. And stakeholders, PSA was at the table, associations that are here today, all pushed back and said, nope. We've been talking about growth. We value it more. It's a more important measure. We should weight it accordingly. So that was all part of that process that Bob was talking about. We also look at chronic absenteeism and progress to English language proficiency. So that's a different growth measure, and it only applies to English language learners as they progress on a different assessment. This is not based on the past assessment, which was PARC, and now is called NJSLA Math and ELA. So that growth measure is actually based on access for ELs, and it just looks at English proficiency. So, something that is another important takeaway, and this is this gets a little technical, and we can have a parking lot of questions or think about if we want to offline about some of the questions around this. But the main point of what this slide is, and a huge pride point in our state plan, which is that when we look at all those percentages, I'm just going to click back, don't mean to make people dizzy, but when we look at all of these things, we are not looking at just all school averages. And that's super important because historically we found that all school averages or all state averages hide a lot of information. They hide a lot about information about what students, what different groups of students are doing. And so we have to, under No Child Left Behind, under vsESSA, we've always had to look at and account for student subgroups. But what we did in New Jersey, and that's the legal term, so I've heard varying degrees of comfort with that term, but we use the term subgroups for the federally required subgroups of different demographics, students of different demographics, as well as students, English language learner students, students with special needs, as well as students who receive free and reduced lunch, or that's our definition in New Jersey, or who are defined as economically disadvantaged. So we say in New Jersey, we're going to look at all school averages as one piece of the pie. And then we're going to look at how all those individual subgroups are performing separately. And so what that means in practice is that it's a calculation that divides, is a 50% calculation. It's 50% all school averages and 50% an average of all of those, the performance of all of those different students in those different demographics. It also means that a student might be in multiple demographics groups, and they might be counted in different ways on that right side of the pie, and that occurs. So if I'm a student who is receiving English language learner programs, I'm also Caucasian, so I'm going to be in the white sub-demographic group and also the English language learner. And so that information comes out in that right side all into and gets rolled up. It's technical and it's math, but to bring back to us to the very first slide, the rationale is that we wanted to make sure that no longer would certain students and the progress of certain students be overshadowed or hidden within those all school averages. It also allows us as a state and someone from the performance office, we like to look at and celebrate performance. So it's also been a very helpful measure to look at where certain subgroups of students are flourishing and growing. We look at SGP and we'll look at certain growth. And so we are in the process of identifying schools that have seen great growth with diverse groups of students. And then we want to go to those schools and say, hey, what are you doing? What programs are going on? That's a technique that I know that Rosie's applied and great schools do. If you're looking at your information in your one classroom, the students are flourishing, a certain group of students are flourishing, you're going to go to that teacher and say, hey, what's going on here? Let's replicate that. So this information works absolutely in both ways and has been really helpful. The last slide, which we recognize was a little displaced, we're going to talk about chronic absenteeism a little bit later, both on the requirements and why we use that, and also how Rosie's engaged with her community around that measurement. But the point being, the next stage is we're going to talk about some federal funding opportunities, and then I'm going to loop back to, that's right? Where's it? Okay. And then we're going to loop back to some performance reports and community engagement. But the chronic absenteeism is just want to make sure that we go back to that and talk about it as a measure that goes into this formula. If that makes sense. Are there any questions about the little, how a bill is made, how ESSA, the plan it comes out in accountability? The plan itself is 150 pages without the appendices. If you have trouble sleeping, I highly encourage downloading that from our website as evening reading. And it also touches on a lot of different points. So we emphasize a lot with stakeholders and really worked a lot on that system because we felt like that was the area in New Jersey we had the most places to continually improve. But as Dale's going to start talking about, there's also federal funding that looks at other opportunities to support our students that come directly from that federal plan. So I'm going to turn it over and be back in a bit.
Good. So as Diana mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the fiscal opportunities for districts within the ESSA plan, but I want to underscore the importance of her very first slide that talked about the importance of the focus on needs of students. Right, and to also reemphasize the importance of the comprehensive needs assessment, because actually there's a Beatles song to this effect that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, and so really as a state and as a community of stakeholders that are engaged in supporting all students, we want to develop plans that are replicable, and that's why there was so much stakeholder engagement involved in creating the plan that Diana has helped shape. So, and another really important piece of that is the root cause analysis. So again, speaking to this audience that has a particular frame around the importance of the arts, I want you to be mindful of the looking at, as a part of those plans, where you can intersect as a community, looking at that root cause analysis. And that forces us as educators to have a different level of understanding about what our students know and where we can support them and know why we're teaching what we're teaching. Because this could be considered by many somewhat of a paradigm shift in that it all goes back to instructional pedagogical shifts to how can we continuously be better at serving our students. And I say that as preface to these funding opportunities because that's where, as a community of arts education stakeholders, you need to be able to see yourself into the narrative and read yourself into the narrative. So I'm going to be speaking more broadly about the federal funding streams, not specific to the arts, because they're also open to all stakeholders, but so that I can frame that within your context of knowing and understanding where this community fits into this picture. Okay? I'm always a whole guy, so I like to kind of set that frame to help us understand where we fit into this schema. So first of all, let's start with there is a new funding stream in the Title 4A, and as you can see, it's a combination of several areas. Several old titles that were combined together, but there are several intersections here that are potential. There are 3 areas in which social emotional learning is contextualized, or there are opportunities for social emotional learning. One is in the safe and well healthy schools, and then in terms of the second area of concern there, well-rounded education, this replaces what was formerly in the previous iterations of the Elementary Secondary Schools Act, was where the definition of the core subjects resided. All right? So there's no longer a definition of what is core, although in New Jersey we have a set of core curriculum content standards within our 7 areas of our separate disciplines of study. So the arts fit within that well-rounded. So for many in the arts education community, that's kind of a signal or a flag about, okay, here's an intersection where we can support our learners, again, going to that root cause analysis in terms of where we intersect, where can we be a part of the larger conversation about how do we all support our learners together, and that everybody in the building has different things to contribute to that. So I'm going to talk about 3 different titles: Title I, Title II, and Title IV. Title I being the part of, is not new. It's been around since 1965, actually. It was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And it was designed to be supplemental money that was over and above what schools are already supposed to be doing to support our most critically needy students, and especially social economically disadvantaged students. All right. So the idea behind Title I is that they have to be struggling learners that are also in low SES categories that need additional help over and above what's already being done. All right. So this has always included the arts. That's not widely known. But in terms of the more recent history about Title I, I'd like to take us back to 2013 with a letter from then Secretary of Education Arne Duncan under the Obama administration, who sent a letter to every Title I arts coordinator in the country, and also to me and my colleagues at CDA, the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education. There are 64 of us around the country with similar job titles, representing 44 states and the Department of Defense and Washington, D.C. So his letter said that, yes, indeed, you can use Title I funds to support arts instruction as a means of meeting the 4 critical goals of Title I, which are to increase student academic achievement, to heighten levels of student engagement, to increase family and community engagement, and then also improve school culture. So it doesn't say that you can use these additional funds for any one subject area specifically, but it's got to be tied back to that critical needs analysis, that root cause analysis of where are our students struggling and how can we support them? And this happens to be an intersection whereby we can use some innovative strategies, because what was happening was that this law is very complex, right? It's about 1,000 pages as opposed to our 150 pages for our ESSA plan. The Title I is about 1,000 pages. And the other caveat is that if you don't spend the money according to those guidelines, it's carefully monitored since it's federal money. Districts have to return the money. And what cash-strapped district is going to want to send money back in the next fiscal year? I certainly wouldn't if I were the superintendent of that district. So it's not surprising that people over time got rather conservative about how this money was being spent. However, Diana mentioned this idea of thoughtfulness and about being aware of the impact of the funding. So what was happening historically is that people were starting to use this money in very safe ways. So for example, one of the allowable expenditures was to hire a reading coach. So for perhaps 20 years, there were districts that typically used their money for their struggling learners, which was an identifiable need, to hire a reading coach, but with no impact on reading scores. Right? So then we have to take a step back if we're looking at this through this lens of school improvement and about thoughtfully expending those monies, because there is a very finite amount of money. And that pot is small, and we have more and more things that we have to do with that money all the time in public education. So is that a useful expenditure? Is that a thoughtful expenditure? Is that an impactful expenditure? Or are there other ways that we can use that money more creatively to greater impact in shorter amounts of time? And that's for a question for all of us, every sector of the community, to be asking. Okay? So there's Title The next place where there's opportunities for us is in Title II. Title II has to do with professional teacher development and supporting the development. And this is really exciting to me because it signals a shift towards the importance of pedagogical content knowledge. And when I talk about pedagogical content knowledge, I'm actually referring back to Lee Schulman's work, who is an educational psychologist who framed that term, pedagogical content knowledge. And it's more than just knowledge of the subject area. And it's more than simply knowledge about assessment. It's an amalgamation of how to use your content knowledge and assessment knowledge situationally that's developmentally appropriate to help advance those learners. So to me, when we're putting federal money behind the professional learning and professional growth of educators, that's a really hopeful sign to me that we are reprioritizing the student and helping to drive student-centered education. Okay, so then Title 4A is the third of those, and that's where well-rounded education resides. And as I said, in well-rounded, that's code word for all the core subject areas. All right, since we no longer have that definition. So, a couple other technical issues here. In Title I, there's been some set-aside money that's increased, so you really start to need to look again how that money is being dispersed. In Title 2A, there's, again, a higher percentage, or 80% percentage of allocation based on the school formulas. And then the last two haven't changed significantly, but we can come back to those technical parameters a little later. Under the overview, I'd like to just point out one thing here in this slide, and that has to do with the hold harmless clause, and this is about indemnification. In the previous law, you could be held accountable, or districts could be held accountable for omissions or of instruction. So that accountability measure has gone away. And so that's what that means. When we think about indemnifications, we all go, what does that mean? It's all right. So that is gone. That's the only major change there. But otherwise, it's there. So there is one other thing that I want to touch on there, and that is the flexibility for funding. Districts have the opportunity or the option of moving funding sources around. So in the first year of the ESSA legislation, the Title IV pot was fairly small. It's a little bigger now, but it's also divided across lots of areas: educational technology, safe schools, and the arts in particular. All right. So there's a larger pot of money again. And so what was happening, if you only had a very small portion, what we found nationally was happening is that many schools were transferring their Title IV money to Title I, which is fine if, again, you're going back to a thoughtful use of those funds and how it's being impacting student performance. All right? So we're just encouraging people to think about, before they move funds from Title IV to Title I, what the intent of those two different funding streams are, and is that money being best served to support all students, right? You can transfer monies. Let's look at the impact, right? So, and now that there's a little more money in Title IV, the likelihood is that you'll have a greater allocation in Title IV, and so it may not be necessary to combine that with other funding streams, right, to have enough money that can have some level of impact. Because if you got 2 nickels, what are you going to do with it, right? It doesn't really help impact. Okay, here we go. Little skip by this. Okay, so talk about some of the changes in language. And this has to do with, this is important because this has changed in terms of those different levels of where you have to have, if you have a small amount, where you can have to go into consortium, all right? So if you're a small district and you receive less than $10,000 in any one of these title fields, then you have to go into a consortium with other districts to be able to use that money, right? So here, this just lays out those different cutoff levels. If you're receiving between $10,000 and $29,000, then the district can spend its fund on any allowable activities within that fund. And then if you're receiving at least $30,000 in all three of those, then there is a disaggregation of where some of that money must go. At least 20% has to go to well-rounded, and again, remember that's dedicated to what we used to call the core subjects, and that at least 20% has to go towards supporting health and safe and healthy school programs and activities, and then a portion which is unnamed in terms of a percentage has to go to technology. All right, so that's an important distinction. Because we have districts that are single K-12 school districts, and we have districts that have 60, 70 schools. So ranging anywhere from 150 to 150,000 students. So those strata of how that money gets divided up becomes important. So there are some other opportunities here when we look into these. If you were to read yourself into the neighborhood, into this narrative about what it means to be a safe, healthy school environment, and I just want to bring this up, this idea up about SEL, about social emotional learning, and that is something that the department and the Arts Ed New Jersey are moving towards embracing. We are one of 20 states that have adopted the SEL competencies, the CASEL SEL competencies, and that part of that has to do with creating a healthy and supportive environment. So again, there are a lot of potential intersections where the language is written in a large frame that this particular community might fit into. I'm going to pass the ball back to Diana.
And if you're shy about the mic, because sometimes I am, we can just repeat your question. So I don't mind doing that at all. It's more important that we have a dialogue, so whatever you're comfortable with. Try to think about that as we move into performance reports and the conversation about stakeholder engagement, because it's really important that we're all at the table having a conversation about how those dollars are spent. And there's going to be a discrepancy. Today we're in a visionary stage, right? We're talking about what we want to see in districts and schools. And this will be a process that we all have to go through to build our capacity to be having such intricate, deep conversations at such a well-informed level. So one of the tools that we provide you from the department are the school performance reports. And this is something that is pretty near and dear to my heart. So I'm a parent in New Jersey. I read my students' school performance reports. I don't read them to be I gotchas for the school. I don't march down to the superintendent and say, on page 55 of the 3,000 pages of data, this is not right. But what I do use it for is to get a snapshot, to understand. We used it to understand where we wanted to move in a recent move in New Jersey. And we use it to start conversations in our household, and what we want all communities to be doing is to be using school performance reports to start conversations in your school community. So I mentioned these are tools, but imperfect. I'm not up here to tell you that every single piece of data on every single page is accurate. There are lots of reasons, there are good reasons why sometimes it's not the most precise number. There's a lot of work at a school level, a district level, and the department level, though, to make it as accurate as possible. So I don't want that message to be lost. But I just want to put it out there that a lot of times when we use the word data in our communities, people get nervous. They get defensive. We get defensive. It can be scary to look at information, and we often engage in fights. I mean, there's no other word, about whether or not, this number is correct versus that number. And that's always good. It's always good to be advocates and careful and thoughtful about our information and understand how that information impacts students directly and impacts communities. So we have to do a lot. We have to value the data while also being real about it. And we really do want, though, this to be a conversation starter. A lot of other states have performance reports that have grades. Your school gets an A, B, C, D, E, or F, or a color in some states, or a number. And it's the state telling you on a variety of performance metrics the value of your school. We in New Jersey at this time do not believe that's our role. We don't do that for a lot of purposeful reasons. We don't think it's up to us at a state level to give you a thorough report and look at all the numbers that we have and say, here's Monroe, we're in Monroe, here's Monroe, here's Trenton, here's Lawrence, here's Morristown, and here's their number, their ranking. And you don't need to think about it. You just need to know that that's the ranking. We actually think it's up to us in the communities to be looking at our information collectively, collaboratively, and saying, what do we need in our communities? And that's a hard conversation. That's tricky. That's difficult. And so this is one tool among many that you'll be using for those conversations. When you're looking at limited dollars, finite dollars from the federal government, from the state government, and raised in your own towns, you're going to have to make hard decisions. And again, as a parent, I might not agree with all the decisions that the other educators and parents and community members want to make in my community. But it is important to us that folks who want to have a say in that conversation are at the table. So this is going to lead into that conversation about stakeholder engagement. But want you to take away, the only thing I want you to take away from our slides about the performance reports is that of our own awareness. These are reports that are coming out in the coming weeks. They tend to get a lot of press coverage. And we don't always control all those messages. We want your message to be that this is a tool that's going out. We have to federally report on that ESSA ranking that I mentioned, the equation that we use to identify what schools need the most comprehensive and targeted support. That's information that's in those reports. And it's important information for communities to understand that your school, where your child goes, has been identified for support, or the school in which you work. But we don't put that on the front page. We don't consider that a ranking. But we also aren't the final say of what goes into newspapers and rankings and all the things that get a lot of clicks in the state. So it's interesting because I think that ranking aspect hurts some of our communities, and it creates a defensiveness in our school communities from the educator perspective, from parent perspective, and so it's the reality within which we live, and I think it's important to balance that that identification is really important. You need to know if your school is struggling to meet the needs of your students based on the performance metrics that we use. That's critical, and we need that information because we need to know where to focus our resources. We have 600 districts, more than 2,500 public schools. We are an agency with multiple limitations from one, stemming from Trenton. We can't go in and help every single one and every single kid, and we have to prioritize where we support that. So that is a tool that comes out in those reports, and it's very important, but it's just not the be all and end all. And today, what I love about the focus of this is our conversation is about important topics like the arts and how we're meeting the needs of all students. So that's the connection to. We give you data, and it's up to you as communities to say, what do our communities need, and what are we going to prioritize? Quick update for what you'll see new in March of 2019. We have added now discipline data. Discipline data was always reported in a separate place, and under Every Student Succeeds Act, the certain suspension rates and expulsions are now going to be also reported at a student subgroup level. We have demographic information for the first time of teachers and administrators. For the last few years, we've had information about experience for teachers and different calculations and numbers. Last year, we added, based on stakeholder feedback, ratios of guidance counselors to students at a district level. You'll see these in the district report. Ratios of nurses to students. Those are also in district reports, and now for the first time, and coming from a place where we're emphasizing increasing the diversity of our educator workforce, we're reporting on demographics of educators. And you'll see more information on the career and tech education aspect of what access students have to certain programs, and they'll also be on the front page of a summary report that I'll show you, which was not highlighted in that spot earlier. And then the last one is dual enrollment reporting. That'll be a change. So the summary reports, and so there are folks here, advocates here, that had a say in what these look like. One change from last year that we made was, if you've ever seen, how many of you have seen our school performance reports? Opened it, clicked on it. So the main report is pages and pages and pages, depending on the size of your school and the grade and the different grades. There can be upwards of, I think, 100 pages or more, because we report a lot. We did hear, though, loud and clear that that can be really overwhelming. And so one step we took last year was to create a summary page with some performance measures, with gauges to be a little bit more understandable in the communities, and a breakdown. So again, here's the balance, right? We wanted to simplify and be clear, but then we also don't want you to lose the forest and the trees, that there's other information that we also care about. But this was a snapshot on, as asked for by educators and parents. We put them out last year. We've done a lot of engagement. Rosie, other folks in here have hosted us to meet with folks in the community to say, does this make sense? Do you understand? Do you understand what that means? How can we improve them? We made some tweaks. We move at a very slow pace at the department. We're like a big cruise ship, but we made some changes and are continually working to improve them. So the last slide here is some feedback. So as you look at, in March, you'll be looking at last year's school performance data. We always want to hear more ideas and better ideas about how to improve our reports. So the narrative at the bottom, school highlights, that's all comes from every school. So schools upload the information that they want us to highlight on this one pager, and we don't. We sometimes don't even edit, but we tried to just edit for grammar and typos, but that's not something that we dictate. It comes from the school itself, and we think that's a very popular, for understandable reasons, feature. We're also reporting this year for after-school programs, something that was asked for, but not on the slide. So those are coming out soon. And again, I just want to reiterate that the bottom line is that as a community, we're continuing to push for the reports to be viewed as conversation starters, for the reports to be viewed as a tool, and give us feedback of how we can make those better, because that's a major aspect of what the service that we provide. So I was recently speaking to a group of folks out to talk to us about our assessment system. And I was giving a quick overview about ESSA, and I was explaining how we were so proud that it was developed by stakeholders and that we focus on growth, and reports are coming out and they're dashboards, so they're not grades. And someone raised their hand and said, well, first of all, I've never heard about ESSA. And second of all, I wish you would say that more. And so I think, and that's not a message that's getting out there. So in any group that we're speaking to, I encourage, plea for all educators and parents to help us spread this word that these are shifts that are happening over time based on lessons learned in other laws. So would love your partnership. And so this is the floating slide. This goes back, how we measure, and chronic absenteeism is actually on that front page summary report for all students, and this just explains to you how it's calculated. So when it's the chronic absenteeism, a student is chronically absent if they are missing more than 10% of the school year. And that's something that's important. So some people, when we first were debating whether or not to include absenteeism and have this conversation, some people got really nervous about their child's flu, that they were out 2 days, or what if you just are on a family trip and you have 1 day. This is about, you're only coming up in this information if you are chronically absent. And that comes from a lot of research and a lot of understanding about schools of how valuable that information is. That if a student who is missing more than 18 days of a 180-day school year, a student needs something. We need to look at that student. We need to understand. there's nothing about chronic absenteeism data that tells you what that student needs, but it's a flag. It's something that we know. There's plenty of evidence to understand that a student who's missing is on track to being chronically absent in September is going to struggle that year. There's evidence about students in kindergarten that are missing that much and their reading rates by third grade. There's evidence that ninth graders who are chronically absent are most at risk for graduating. We at the state don't know why. It's up to communities to look at that. But as a lot of the stakeholders came together for the ESSA plan, we said, what is a measure that we could use to identify, as a dipping stick to say something's going on here? What is a measure that we could use that would be a starting point for lots of conversations? And we think that chronic absenteeism as a state is a pretty solid tool to start those conversations. It's just not that root cause analysis, and that's where all the hard work comes. This is the calculation. The hard work is figuring out why. And it's just with pride that I've worked with educators all over the state and been witness to some really great outcomes at the school level that came from just conversations about chronic absenteeism. And so I think today plays a very important role in that as someone who sees firsthand how students access to courses where they can thrive and do well and have a well-rounded education leads to students flourishing and doing well and coming to school and enjoying their experience. So that's the little precursor to then what the action steps are. Rosie's going to talk about the hard work. So before she does that, I have the privilege to recap a little bit of what Bob was talking about as far as the engagement that went into the state plan. And the takeaway here is we did a lot of intense work as a state. There were folks that all over the state, I mean, Rosie, and Bob in this room dedicated hours and hours and hours to help develop that state plan. And it's important to know that, like, as we are enacting this, as we're putting out report cards, as we are looking at what schools need the most help, that was at that time very well informed. It's also important to note that what we want to see is that kind of collaboration replicated at district and school levels. But it was really hard at a state level, and it's just harder at a district level. And I just want to make sure that that's a kind of resounding theme, that you're here because you're engaged and as important advocates this work. And it's just as much about building the process and the structure in your communities to have these conversations as it is to actually give input about what you prioritize. And so I think while we're really proud of the outreach that happened, we have a lot more to go. Like I said, there are millions of people that have no idea about our ESSA plan, and there are millions of people who don't understand the link between that, that vision at a state level and at the school level, and it doesn't necessarily matter for all kids. What matters is are our students getting what they need? And so I think it's about having more conversations like this. We were talking before, that plan is a living document. It deserves to be looked at again and over the coming months and years and say, okay, let's think about what's happened, what's worked, what doesn't work, and move from there. So the other thing I want to flag is that a shift at the department that occurred in our ESSA outreach is that we moved from sharing testimony or sharing in a public hearing kind of setting for every single type of outreach, moving from a hearing type setting to roundtable conversations. It's not that they didn't occur, it's that they now occur at every level, I think, throughout the department more than they did before. And it's a lot of work, and we want to see that happening in all districts. That involvement is not necessarily going to speak before a board one time, 1 month, and say, here's what I think that needs to happen, and then you walk away, and policymakers walk away, and there's no collaboration. It's about those hard conversations. So again, not to negate those types of outreach, but to identify that we at the department realize that sometimes we relied on that too heavily to do a checkbox. So that gets us into the requirements for ESSA. that really emphasize when all those federal funds are spent that Dale went over, you as stakeholders need to be at the table. And there's very prescriptive rules. There are very prescriptive rules at the federal level of how before every federal dollar is spent, there needs to be a meaningful engagement. And they actually spell out per title who needs to be at the table. And so you are getting this slide. It's on our website. It's important. This slide and this information is not just on our website under an overview of our state plan. It's also on our website under a district handbook for increasing stakeholder engagement. Folks like Rosa and Rosie actually helped us write it. It was based on an Opportunity Institute model for a national model. And we put out a handbook because this is hard work. And we want districts and communities to understand that if you're spending federal dollars, you're obligated to be engaging in meaningful conversations. But then at the same time, we also want to see that it goes above and beyond checklists. So this is the checklist of who needs to be there. And we're hoping that the community conversation where communities are engaged in those conversations, that when your district is developing their state plan, their district plan, you're engaged in the root cause analysis, looking at data together collaboratively. You're also looking at developing the plan and then implementing the plan. And that people aren't going home once it's implemented. It's a constant cycle of evaluation. So this, I know, is a very important tool for advocates to have on hand to understand that this is something that you can demand from your districts. It's critical. Folks demanded it at the state level, and we would not have done as much stakeholder engagement if advocates weren't at the table saying this is the type of meaningful engagement that must occur. And so it really is important to also replicate that at a district level. But now, this is just another quick chart. And my last comment before Rosie starts talking is there are prescriptive rules about who needs to be at the table. But what we recognized in order to continue to have equitable access to that table, every conversation should start with who's not at this conversation. Every conversation with you as an advocate should be, like, I'm not alone. Let's say you are advocating for the arts. You should consider, if you're at a conversation about the priorities of a district, whether or not you should be going there alone or whether or not you should be having a collective conversation with folks that care equally about other subjects and other areas where their students could do well. So I think that was a big lesson learned for us of we tried to make it open, but we were always finding more people that had really important perspectives and things to say about and ways to help drive where we're going in our plan. So that's something that's important, and I hope you help your districts, whether or not you're an educator in a district or a parent or an advocate. I hope we can do this collaboratively because we learned one of our takeaways from our experience, and Rebecca Wills is in the audience and was a huge contributor to the structure. It's not complicated. Like, you want to have a roundtable conversation, you need a classroom and you need chairs, right? Like, that's not complicated. You need to be committed to saying we're going to make a collective community decision. It's not hard to conceptualize. It's just really hard work to actualize. And, you're dealing with, all of us in a community have lots of other things to do during the day, and you're dealing with, you need to have internal collective understanding of what's out there. You can't be ahead of your school communities. You can't go out and ask communities questions that your internal community never got to sit and grapple with. You have to really schedule things. You have to have them. You have to have access from a language perspective, from a time perspective, from a doorway perspective. You need to be creating conversations and having a lot of different people have access to those conversations. That's hard work. It's grunt work. It's roll up your sleeves and make it happen. And so I think that as we are all coming to the table to have conversations about how to serve our students better, it's just something that is an honest look back and ways that we can always improve. So I I think it comes out, I admire the advocates in this room that I've worked with a lot, and I'm really privileged that Rosie can spell out for us how all of this stuff from the great bureaucracy of the Department of Education can be actualized and students realize the benefits thanks to advocates like Rosie. It's a big charge.
Good morning. I head up Patterson Education Fund, which is a nonprofit organization in Patterson, and we work to engage citizens in the improvement of Patterson Public Schools and in improved outcomes for Patterson children. So we got excited when we heard about vsESSA at the onset because our role is engaging citizens in improvement of public schools. And we found out, because we're members of a national organization called the Dignities in Schools campaign, that stakeholder engagement was being emphasized in vsESSA. So we watched as it was rolled out at the federal level through the campaign, and then as soon as the states were required to submit the names of the people at the Department of Education who would be in charge of vsESSA, we got that list from our national partners. And we called the DOE and asked for Diana. And everybody was going, well, how do you know? How did you get her name? But she was gracious and agreed to meet with us. So myself and Linda Reed, who represents the Parent Education Organizing Council in Patterson, and an organizing entity, and Linda's also on the PEF staff, went down and met with Diana and a team from the State Department of Education and told them we were very interested in helping to move the stakeholder engagement and wanted to make sure that we could help in Patterson, but also help on the statewide level. So that's how we became the only two local organizations on the state vsESSA team, as others were statewide organizations such as the PTA, the NAACP, etc. It was phenomenal working with the group. So that's a little bit about who we are at PEF. We're celebrating 36 years of advocacy and activism in Patterson this year. And I've been on board for 26 of them. Started when I was 10. I've been on board for 26 of them, the last 5.5 as the executive director. So I want to start with talking about the arts. We're not an arts organization, but we believe that kids need a well-rounded education, and the arts is a part of that. We also acknowledge that the arts is a core subject, and people tend to forget that. So we're a state takeover district, and one of our first state district superintendent decided to implement a program he called Paradigm. And Paradigm was a shift, obviously, related to the word, to just English language arts and math at the elementary level. So the sciences were removed, no social studies, very little PE, and the arts were taken away. So we had concerns from early on about what was going on with the arts. As he left and other superintendents came in, we saw a return of the arts. And then there were budget cuts. Somewhere around 2010, 2011, the district had to cut funding and laid off all the non-tenured teachers, which means that all the arts and music teachers were moved into regular classrooms. So again, the arts suffered. And we launched a campaign to return the arts to Patterson. We met with people at the district level. We galvanized people inside of in the community. We talked with arts educators. And the campaign that we came up with was to have kids show up at the school board meeting, sign in for their 3 minutes of public portion, and perform. So we had a phenomenal school board meeting where 20 or so kids signed up at the public portion and performed. And that brought attention back to the district about what we were missing. And we noted that these kids had not gotten elementary level arts because of Paradigm, but that they'd gotten arts in community settings, in churches, in dance classes, etc. and made our case to return arts to the district. It took a while, but now here we have some work from community partners. The women here, the young women here dancing are at Rosa Parks School for the Performing Arts, and they're actually parts of a program that Sharon Miller Performing Academy in Montclair comes in and works with Patterson teachers to do some arts integration work at the elementary and high school level. We have a couple of STEAM programs, and so I decided to also share some work that kids did in a summer STEAM program here. It's entitled Earth Art because they're actually doing environmental work and looking at how to do some remedies to the harm caused by human use of the Passaic, human contamination of the Passaic River, and how that affects our life and our water sources. And then one other child did something around President Obama. So I thought it would be nice to talk to that. So we've also been paying a lot of attention to chronic absenteeism and reducing it in Patterson. Well before it was a part of the vsESSA plan in 2011, we joined the Grade Level Reading Campaign, which is a national campaign to have every child read on grade level by the end of third grade. And we do that through early literacy, reducing summer learning loss, and reducing chronic absenteeism. So that's where we got introduced to the words, to the phrase chronic absenteeism. We've worked with Attendance Works, which I think they get the credit for coining that phrase, chronic absenteeism, since then to think about ways to reduce chronic absenteeism in Patterson. And we use not only do we use their toolkit, but we pulled Patterson parents together to do interviews and a listening tour to help them develop the toolkit for preschool that is being used. We asked parents, what are the things that prevent you from bringing your kids to school every day? Sometimes it was like, I didn't feel like getting out of bed because it's not mandatory at the preschool or kindergarten level, even in Patterson. And sometimes it rained or the other child had a doctor's appointment. So it was very informative about what we needed to do. They've developed a wonderful toolkit, which is available open source on their site. It's Attendance Works. Google them, it'll pop up. But this is one of the tools that we use in Patterson. We've used lots of tools, success mentors, so that people are checking in with kids after they miss 2 days in a month. We're still doing that. But I wanted to share this song, and it's sung to the tune of Jingle Bells. You've been listening for a long time. Who knows Jingle Bells? All right, you want to try it out? Okay. Up we get, sleepyhead, up and down our way. It's 8 o'clock, time to rock, success is a blink away. Hey, hair is brushed, teeth are clean, and your bag is ready to go. It's Head Start at 9, then breakfast time, so your brain can know and grow. Woohoo! So we encourage schools to use this song. Obviously, you can't use it at the high school level. However, Kalina Berriman, who's with Abbott Leadership Institute and on the Rutgers faculty, did a poem rap song piece that I encourage you to look up. Ask Kalina for it. I can give you her contact information. She'll love it. And use that with your older kids. They really embrace that as well. I have restorative practices up there because it's our latest piece on how we're engaging the community. But I want to start with how we engage the community as the state built its vsESSA plan and as we built our local vsESSA plan. We invited Diana, as she mentioned, and her team to come to Patterson several times. We did focus groups, we did listening circles, we did forums. When the school progress report cards, the progress cards changed from the school report cards, we invited the state in to come in and talk to Patterson parents about how to use the progress reports. She showed them the summary. We delved into certain schools to find out what are the indicators that we ought to be looking at there, how subgroups are performing, how parents can understand and use the progress reports to help improve their schools. Again, not a gotcha, but how do you use this to help make sure that your child is getting what your child needs and that your school is providing what all the children need? It's all about meeting the needs. So over the past years, we got introduced to restorative practices. It's an old indigenous people practice from all over the world where people meet in circles and have conversation. That's a part of our attempt to influence absenteeism, to influence behavior in the school, and to reduce suspensions and expulsions. So we came to restorative practices through our work to increase attendance and reduce expulsions and suspensions. Since then, we've had lots and lots of listening circles about all kinds of topic in Patterson. And recently in December, we took this team of 11 community members, administrators, and teachers from Patterson Public Schools to Portland, Oregon for a training so that we are now a core team of circle keepers. Our work now is we are master trainers. Our work now is to train others in restorative practices so that kids take ownership of their behavior, so that they are peer-led and peer-monitored, so that we have ways to diffuse situations and that every child will have good relationships in schools. And we think when we get to that point, it will encourage kids to want to be in school and certainly to help them stay in schools when they get there. We're now doing circles for the community. Open invitation once per month for anyone who wants to come and have a circle conversation to come in and talk about topics concerning education. But it's also a tool for social and emotional well-being. It's amazing how when you ask a simple question about how are you feeling right now and go around the circle, we could spend the entire hour pulling that apart and helping people to get to a better place inside the circle. A really, really powerful practice. So there's one other thing I want to talk to you about, although there's not a slide here for it, and it's our work to form an arts task force in Patterson. We formed an arts education task force several years ago, funded by Dodge, thank you, Wendy, and pulled community arts educators together to do two things. One, to increase kids' access to the arts in and out of schools, and two, to push, advocate for Patterson Public Schools to offer a full arts curriculum to all kids. We've had success over the years in increasing the arts offerings in the community, and last year, for the first time, Patterson fully restored their arts program, rewrote their arts curriculum at every grade level, and we're now celebrating this year, this current school year, for the first time, every child in Patterson Public Schools has access to the arts in school. Thank you. We're really happy to report that. At the local level, with our ESSA planning, both for the district plan and the school plans, we've pushed back when people submit their plans to make sure that they've done a needs assessment, to make sure that the community partners are fully engaged, the parents are fully engaged. We have full service community schools in Patterson, and we had a couple of schools that sent us their plan, because we're on the district team as community members, sent us their plan that did not include their community schools partner as a partner in their essay engagement plan. Pushed them back, not acceptable. So our work is to make sure that stakeholders are truly engaged in this stakeholder outreach. We've done a lot of it around the plan development, around hiring our superintendent in Patterson, and she has also bought into the stakeholder engagement and has listening circles regularly with parents and with students, so that we're keeping the districts and the community, we're keeping our an ear to the pulse of the community and making sure that we're addressing needs as those needs are identified. Again, for the first time in this budget that's being created, the district is looking at allocating funds not strictly per pupil across the district, because we're a Title I district, but according to need. And the schools have to identify that need in their plan and say how the needs will be addressed and how much funding they need in order to address those needs. So wanted to give you that snapshot that ties a little bit into the arts and a little bit into what we have to do around stakeholder engagement in ESSA. And I encourage you to work with your districts wherever you are to make sure that when we say stakeholder engagement, we're doing it well. The state set a wonderful example in the way that they developed our state ESSA plan. And I encourage you to follow, and I'm happy to share some other tools with anyone who would like them. Thank you.
What I'm going to talk about is what does any of this have to do with the arts? What does this have to do with the arts, and how does that connect to me in my particular building? So an old friend of mine said, turn it into radio station WIIFM, which is what's in it for me. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's in it for you through some of these different sections. The key connections between ESSA and arts education. And one of the areas that we talked about is Title I. Title I is an area that we're very familiar with. And how does Title I connect to the arts? Well, and while I'm here, I want to remind you at the bottom of your agenda is actually a link. And that's the link to where all of this information all the presentations will be, as well as additional resources to connect you to more information from the Arts Education Partnership, from the professional associations that go into the connections between ESSA and the arts disciplines. So we have the expanded use of Title I funds and how arts education may be used as a tool to achieve Title I goals. And those goals are student learning and mastery, school culture and climate, student engagement, and family and community engagement. So how can we use the arts to address each of these four things? So instead of me talking to you about it, everything's better in cartoons, right? So we've got a cartoon for you.
This is a story about how Title I funding that starts in Washington, D.C. can end up bringing the arts to students just like me. It all starts here. Every year since 1965, Congress has set aside money to make sure that every child in the United States gets the benefit of a high-quality education. Title I funds are designed to support educational opportunities for the kids who need them the most. Nearly $15 billion a year goes to high-need schools in underserved areas in all 50 states. The end goal of the Title I program is academic achievement. So how do we get there? Through student learning, giving kids the tools they need to master content knowledge. Student engagement, making sure that kids are involved and focused on learning. Positive school climate and culture. That's when kids want to come to school and stay in school. And family and community engagement, where parents, guardians, and community members feel welcome and participate in their school community. Schools and districts decide how to spend Title I money by selecting those strategies that best meet the needs of their students. So you're probably wondering, what's all that got to do with the arts? Well, did you know music can lead to increased understanding in math? And oh, by the way, theater teaches kids to work together and get engaged in their own learning. And while we're on the subject, visual art can create a more welcoming school climate. And of course, seeing their children perform or exhibit brings parents or guardians to school and increases family and community engagement. I mean, who doesn't want to see their child shine? And how do we know the arts can make such a big difference? It's called research. There's tons of research studies that prove the positive education benefits of the arts. And that's important because Title I strategies need to be backed up by research. You can find out lots more about this by going to Title1Arts.org. So the next time you're thinking about how to make the best use of your Title I funds, Think about how the arts are part of a complete education that helps me discover who I am along the way.
So the Title I Arts, here in New Jersey, we actually have a Title I Arts website that really talks about how you can make the connection between arts education and Title I. And it'll be on the resource page, but it's Title1artsNewJersey.org. Or you just go to the Title I Arts website and they'll have a link to our particular page. But it breaks down areas of how you can connect to Title I, how you develop the plan, how you do your research, but also what research is available based on the 4 key Title I goals. So that you can go in there and whether you're in elementary, middle, or high school, look at what are some of the research to support the Title I goals through the arts. So that, again, another resource that's available for you when you're looking at, okay, how might we apply Title I to this work? Another thing that's important to understand in Title I is that there is Title I now frowns upon the idea of pullouts, where you take students and you're going to pull them out of a class and you're going to give them remediation. And we saw that in the arts for a long time where, oh, you're not going to go to your music class today, we're going to put you in your English remediation course. That's no longer acceptable practice. So it's something that you have to understand within Title I that if you're in an environment where those students are being pulled from your arts programs, they really shouldn't be doing that. And you should be talking to your administrators about that. Also in Title I is stakeholder engagement, and certainly Rosie touched on it, but you should be engaged in the process, and the community should be engaged in the process of developing the Title I school plan. You have the right to be a part of that process. Oftentimes people think that it's up to somebody else to do it, but no, you can be engaged in that process as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Standards and assessment within in ESSA. It talks about the state should have standards, which we do and we've had for a long time, as well as assessment. So that's something that's really a state responsibility, but you need to know that because your curriculum needs to be aligned to the standards that are developed. Title II is about professional development. Okay? Funding available through Title II for professional development in all areas, including the arts. So one of the things that we want to emphasize is don't look for where it says the arts in the law. Think about how you may apply the arts to what's being talked about. Okay, so if this is about professional development, well, how does that connect to the arts? Well, our arts teachers are defined as part of a well-rounded education. Arts is defined as a part of a well-rounded education. So they are entitled just as much as the math teacher and the language arts teachers to have professional development and to be supported in professional development through Title II. Okay? But the big one, the big new change is Title IV. All right? Title IV is this brand new bucket, this brand new thing that we're looking at. And what's important to understand about Title IV, because it's a new section, unlike Title I, where people have been using Title I dollars for 50 years now, and they get used to how they're using it, and they tend to get into, well, we're already committed our Title I dollars to this thing, and we've always done it, so we're going to continue to do it. Title IV is brand new. It's a brand new funding stream, so no one's really got dibs on it yet. They're not all there. They're not all. It's not money that's been allocated year after year after year. This is brand new funding, and therefore it's an opportunity through the stakeholder engagement and the plan development process to see how you engage the arts and how the arts can be included in that. And some of the opportunities there include sequential arts education programs, support for sequential arts learning, including tools and materials to support that. Initiatives that use the arts to engage students, right? We talked about student engagement earlier. We talked about how does student engagement then impact chronic absenteeism. So all of these things begin to connect to one another. Programs that integrate the arts into other subject areas. We talked about arts integration, we talked about STEAM programs, but there's a variety of ways to do this. And again, many resources that we have on the resource page for you to support your efforts in those in your community. We could spend an entire day just on talking about sequential arts learning and arts integration, but we're not doing that today. But Title IV Part A says activities and programs in music and the arts. This is the second area that they call out within the law. And it's designed to support LEAs in providing programs and activities, again, to improve student engagement and achievement. Right? So really important to understand that we are a block in one of the building blocks in Title IV-A, and we are one of the anchor blocks within well-rounded education. So some of the things that the funds can be used for in the well-rounded education area, we talked about arts courses, programs that integrate the arts, programs that focus on student engagement and school culture, increasing access for underrepresented students in high-quality arts courses, making sure that we're getting all of our students, our underrepresented students, that they too should have the opportunities to be involved in the arts. And then activities including the arts that promote programs to teach traditional American history, civics, economics, geography, and government education. Okay, these are all ways that you can include the arts in there, as well as technology for the arts. Okay? When they talk about how do you use technology in education from an arts perspective, we think about, well, how do we apply technology in the arts? How do we use technology as a vehicle to provide knowledge and instruction within the arts? The second area they talk about within Title IV-A is safe and healthy students, and Dale touched on this a little bit. But districts may include the arts in strategies that help ensure that schools provide supports to keep students safe and healthy. And these things include things like trauma recovery and programs that use the arts as a therapeutic measure. Okay, there's opportunities in there. School-based mental health services and partnership programs. Programs that support social and emotional learning. There's a lot of talk about SEL here in the state. And I think everyone's just now making the connections to what many of our arts educators know that we do that address social and emotional learning within our arts classrooms, but now trying to recognize the intentional connection between the arts and the specific social emotional learning competencies that we have in the state. And then the third area is the effective use of technology. So within ESSA, you can use the technology funds to purchase technology for arts classrooms. Schools have used it to buy instructional keyboard labs, software, new digital design programs, TV media studios. Also can use it for professional development for arts educators to incorporate technology. All right, so here's another opportunity to kind of backdoor professional development because you're doing it in a way that connects to the effective use of technology. And then programs that use technology consistent with the principles of the universal design for learning that support the needs of all students. And also, how do we connect students that are in remote areas via digital learning opportunities? So here are some examples of what some schools have done to use Title IV Part A fundings. In Dayton, Ohio, a district purchased musical instruments to rebuild their program that had been dormant for a decade. They wanted to put a program back in place, hired a teacher, didn't have instruments, used Title IV-A funds to buy instruments. Another school district used them to provide professional development in New York to help their teachers understand the new New York learning standards that were developed. And then I got a couple more of them that came to me just recently. There was a school in Pennsylvania that developed a band and drama camp workshop for students. There was another one that used the funds to purchase a new piano because when they did their needs assessment, they were able to identify that as one of the needs that would support the learning for all students. Okay? Again, it connects back to that needs assessment piece. And there are many, many other examples of how the funds were used to bring in a theater program from a cultural organization to support specific learning objectives within the school. But one of the key things that all of these require is that needs assessment and community engagement. Rosie touched on it, and I know that Diana was pleading about this, and I can't reinforce it enough that this is the opportunity. This is where the rubber meets the road. When these plans are being developed, being at the table as part of stakeholder engagement is really important. So some things to think about, questions to ask regarding a needs assessment. Who is leading the needs assessment in your district? And who's developing the district application for the state, right? So if you want to figure out, okay, how is this game played? Who are the people that are making the decisions? What is the process that's involved in conducting a needs assessment? I spoke with one superintendent in a district who will not be named, who told me their needs assessment was that they just decided themselves what they wanted to do and they turned that in. There wasn't any stakeholder engagement. There was a needs assessment that they did internally, but it wasn't a needs assessment where they brought the stakeholders together. This is what we want to do. That may not necessarily be reflective of what the community thinks is important for the use of those funds. Who's engaged in the needs assessment process? And are there opportunities to participate in the advisory group? Rosie gave us a great example of how they were involved in that process and actually able to weigh in on some of the plans and push the plans back to the schools because they weren't reflective of the community's input. How much funding is available? How much money do you get in your district for the different Title programs? How many of you know how much money you get for Title 4A right now? Right. That's an opportunity to find out. Find out how much money is there, learn about the process, how do you get engaged? And then what are the priorities that are identified through the needs assessment? And then some things to ask at the district level. Among the district's identified priorities, what are the opportunities that exist for the arts and arts integrated learning? So as Rosie said, if in our community it's chronic absenteeism, it doesn't say the arts, right? But chronic absenteeism, the arts play a role in addressing chronic absenteeism. If it's parental engagement, right, that may be an objective for the district. All right, then look at that and go, how might the arts be utilized to address that particular issue? Don't look for the arts in the language. Look at the language and figure out how do the arts intersect with it. Because we're part of a well-rounded education, the inclusion of the arts is really kind of inherent through all of it. And that's the lens that you have to look at when you're looking at this information. Is there evidence of the role the arts can play in addressing the priorities of the district? What's the research? Again, we point you back to the Title I Arts website, and also in the resources, there's some links to the research in each of the areas of the vsESSA plan that will address those particular research elements that will help you. And are there other models that other states or districts have utilized? I just went through 4 from 4 different states. There are plenty of other models out there on how districts are using this. And then the last piece I just want to touch on real quickly is the accountability piece. Because Diana talked about, well, we have the accountability here in the state. Chronic absenteeism is one of those measures it's the voluntary measure within the accountability system. And we have research to support the impact of the arts in that area. A new Seton Hall study that just came out last spring, I asked this particular research question. What is the nature of the relationship between the total percentage of middle school student population who participate in the arts and the school's rate of attendance? And can that relationship be classified as value added? And the answer is yes. They went through all of these metrics and found that arts participation significantly impacts the school climate variable of chronic absenteeism. As you see the participation rates in middle school in the arts increase, you see a decrease in chronic absenteeism. Okay? Supporting research. So when somebody says, where's the research for this? Seton Hall study, and we'll have that link for you as well. And then we're going to be hearing from Hedgepath Williams this afternoon. They'll be talking about how they've used the arts to address chronic absenteeism. Dave will talk a little bit about the connection with Little Kids Rock. Then we have our school performance reports. And within the school performance reports, There are visual and performing arts measures. Okay, how do we know the percentage of kids in middle school that are involved in the arts? Because we report it. It's part of our school performance reports. So this is one school, and it shows you how the school is doing. 71% of this particular school, the students are involved in the arts. State average is 52. And then it gives you the breakdown for music, dance, drama, and visual art with the connection between this is the school number and this is the state average. So you have the information there to give you a sense of how are you doing and whether or not in your district is that good enough. Are you happy with what you see? Great. Are there ways to make more improvements? That's also an important lens to look at as well. So in our performance reports right now, we have unique student participation in each discipline, the unique total students enrolled in any arts, and the state average for each measure based on the school configuration. So we're comparing middle schools to middle schools and high schools to high schools. So we're not making sure that we're doing apples to apples. In the future, Diana asked, well, what would you like to see in the future for these performance reports? And if you have ideas, please bring them to the Department of Education. But we're asking for the reports now for elementary schools. We're asking for student arts teacher ratio by school and by discipline as well. We're looking at course level enrollment, not just the individual discipline, but what are the individual courses that they're involved with. And then we're looking at per pupil arts spending as part of our comparative spending guide, how much funds are actually dedicated to the provision of arts instruction, and how do we look at that between individual schools. And then also under accountability, we have CUSAC. Okay, so everyone goes through CUSAC. Within CUSAC, there's an aspect of it regarding arts education where they have to demonstrate that they have the curriculum and program in place to ensure that they are meeting the state requirements. Okay, so that's another piece of the accountability aspect of things that we have. And then there's also the connection throughout this, through everything, is social emotional learning. So I think that you think about how social emotional learning and the arts addresses issues in your particular communities. And again, all this information will be available for you up on our website. And the website and the link, there's a long link at the bottom of your page, and then there's a short link that I have up here. We'll leave this up here during the break so that you can write it down. But I hope this begins to give you a sense of the reason for all the deep background was so that you could understand, okay, what's the law in general? And what have some communities done, like what they've done in Patterson around stakeholder engagement? And now how does that connect to what we want to do into our individual districts? And when we come back from the break, we're going to go into a panel discussion that will be brief on the panel discussion part and more getting into your questions and discussion with you as we come out of that. So I'd like to go, we're going to break for 10 minutes, and then we'll be back here at 11:15 to begin again. Great, thank you.